All Hell's Breaking Loose, Lick It Up, and My Stint as a Movie Star, 1983, 1984. KISS was now made up of Eric Carr, Vinnie Vincent, Paul, and me. We liked Creatures of the Night and hoped for the best, but the album did poorly. We booked an American tour, and it was the least successful tour we'd ever done. The music scene was changing. Acts like Michael Jackson were in ascent, and no one showed up to hear us play. In North America, that is. Abroad, especially in South America, we played to the biggest audiences we'd ever played, stadiums full of people, even though the experience was depressing in some respects. It opened our eyes to the idea that no one city and no one marketplace is definitive. If you're not making it in the United States, go to Brazil. If you're not making it in Colombia, try Italy. The biggest change at that time was the rise of MTV. Music was being overtaken by a certain visual style. We'd been a visual band since the beginning, but oddly, our idea of visual panache didn't necessarily translate in the world of early 80s rock and roll, which was dominated by hair metal bands. Hair bands were dominant because they gave younger teenagers, and especially younger girls, access to a kind of rock music that had been considered too dangerous for them before. Girls who were only 13 and 14 were having their first brushes with sexuality, and for their early crushes they were turning to these hair metal bands, to Bon Jovi, to Poison. As it turned out, we had one band member who was perfectly suited for this transition, Paul Stanley. He was at home being that kind of frontman, dancing on the stage. So for the first time in our career, we did exactly what we saw was happening with other bands. It's not worth debating the justification, worrying over originality and inspiration. We were a working band. Instead of being leaders, we decided basically to follow. At around that time, we decided to drop the one visual element that had been associated with KISS most strongly, and from the very beginning, our makeup. When we started working on Lick It Up, it was a good time musically. We had Michael James Jackson producing once again, and Vinnie Vincent was our guitarist, and a contributing songwriter. Vinnie and Paul were particularly successful during this period. The two of them wrote Lick It Up, the title track from that album.
Don't wanna wait till you know me better. Let's just be glad for the time together. Got such a treat and it's time you taste it. There ain't no reason on earth to waste it. It ain't a crime to be good to yourself. Lick it up, lick it up. Oh, it's only right now.
In the middle of recording the album, more or less out of nowhere, Paul pulled me aside and said, "Gene, I think it's time to take our makeup off." His reasoning was sound. With all the personnel changes, we had moved farther and farther away from the plausible characters. Vinnie Vincent's character, the Wizard, wasn't sticking with fans the way the Demon or the Star Child had. "Let's prove something to the fans," Paul said. "Let's go and be a real band without makeup." I reluctantly agreed. I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but I heard what Paul was saying. There was nowhere else for us to go. We did a photo session just to see what it would look like. We looked straight into the camera lens. We were defiant. I made one small concession to the fans. I stuck out my tongue to try to keep something that connected us with the past, to remind fans that we weren't a brand new band. We decided to unveil ourselves live on MTV. First, superimposed over our faces, were photos of us in full KISS makeup. As the VJ announced each of our names, the makeup photos dissolved to our bare faces. We made the best of it, but I was scared stiff. Lick It Up was released and immediately tripled the sales of Creatures of the Night. It went platinum, and we were soon filling up concert halls again. This was clearly a new lease on life.
With the new characters, we were one step removed from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, what the hell was Vinny's Ankh about? Rather than keeping the original personas and images alive, we had become a ridiculous menagerie. What was next? Turtle Boy? As we began to record Lick It Up, we thought about getting a manager to replace Bill. Up to this point, Howard Marks had taken over the business aspects of Bill's job, and we were basically managing ourselves. So we went to see a famous manager in L.A. and told him that we had decided to take the makeup off. "Why don't you keep it on half your face?" he said. "On half of my face?" That was when we realized how out of touch and out of sync most people were with Kiss. After all, Creatures was a good album. The problem was that people were listening with their eyes instead of their ears. If people didn't like what they saw, it was unlikely they were going to like what they heard. Agreeing to take the makeup off was, understandably, much harder for Gene. It was easier for me to do than for the guy with a ponytail on top of his head spitting blood all over the stage. But when Creatures failed, common sense led us to the conclusion that we simply had no choice. Taking off the makeup gave us the best chance to continue. Even so, Gene didn't agree to jump until we were at the edge of the cliff. It was a leap of faith that was necessary for our own survival. We were going to have to find out whether we were a good enough band to exist without the makeup. If what people always said about us was true, that we were a gimmick, then I felt it was time to call it a day because we didn't deserve to continue. Was I nervous? Not really. I knew that what I did was from the heart, whether or not my face was white. It had become innate. I was going to continue to be exactly the same character. When people gave us kudos or told us we had guts for doing it, I was the first to say that we didn't do it for anything other than our own survival. There was no alternative. I don't mind taking credit for things done in the spirit of risk-taking, but this wasn't one of those moments. It wasn't a brave or noble move because it wasn't done from a place of strength. We were backed into a corner. I was also still reeling from finding out about Donna's marriage. I felt dazed and numb. I was seeing a psychiatrist at the time, and in the middle of a conversation one day he said, "The best thing to help you forget a woman is another woman." That was one of the most eye-opening things I ever heard during a therapy session. I was like, "What? That's not deep. Really?" I was looking for some Zen piece of advice, and this caught me totally off guard. Well, okay, I guess I can go with that. After that session, I thought to myself that maybe one way to feel better was to write a song about feeling better. The best way to move forward might be to sing a song about moving forward. I read somewhere that when Beethoven wrote his Second Symphony in 1802, a piece that as a kid I'd found extremely uplifting, he was suicidal. Maybe I could write myself out of a funk too. Vinny and I wrote the song Lick It Up in my place on 80th Street in the music room with its now empty lighted guitar cases. Before we wrote, we tried to figure out what sort of thing we were going to try to do, and the therapist's words rang in my ear. We quickly came up with the title Lick It Up, which sounded great. Life's a treat, and it ain't a crime to be good to yourself. It was a universal sentiment and something that I still certainly believed, whether or not I was living it every minute. It sure felt better than singing a song about being sad. Plus, the act of writing a great song, regardless of its sentiment, made me feel good. That was part of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. That was part of working my way out of the darkness. Creating was a way I was able to reestablish my footing. Other songs on Lick It Up, like A Million to One, hewed more closely to how I was feeling. I think we all like to believe we're irreplaceable in a relationship and that nobody will ever give the person we love what we did, and A Million to One came out of that sentiment. Of course, it was a bit unrealistic and self-serving in addition to not being true. Even though there was an excitement about taking off the makeup, it didn't mean our music had to change. We had been happy with the production on Creatures and felt confident working with Michael James Jackson again, continuing to build on our return to rock and roll. As the album neared completion, I felt excited when I saw the proofs of the cover. There we were. It was a declaration of sorts, and for all we were leaving behind, it was really saying something. I thought we were making a statement about the band and about the validity and credibility of it in our own eyes. Taking off the makeup said something about how much we valued the band. We could have just thrown in the towel and gone home. Instead, we were willing to shed our armor. I also realized that as soon as the record came out, I would no longer have that separation to cushion the impact, positive and negative, of success. The person who was famous would be the same one as the guy walking down the street, but that could be fun, too. I was going to be much more recognizable and visible, so in that sense it couldn't be bad, especially when it came to getting women. And anyway, I'd had years of adapting to fame, and all those years in makeup had provided a transition. So it wasn't going to be like diving into a pool of ice water. Up to that point, MTV had always ignored us. We had filmed one of those "I Want My MTV" promos, and they never aired it. The video we had shot for Creatures, "I Love It Loud," didn't get played. They chose not to give us any exposure, even though we desperately needed it in the wake of the Elder debacle to show that we had recommitted ourselves to doing what Kiss did best. We were considered uncool at a network whose taste was led by a bunch of college interns. Suddenly, when we unmasked ourselves, all that changed. MTV finally embraced us at some level. We came up with a made-for-MTV unmasking. If you think about it, it was really just the unmasking of me and Gene. The other two guys were pretty much unknown commodities. That's not meant to disparage Eric or Vinny, but having played on an album that barely registered in the pop consciousness, they weren't much of a draw as far as unmasking went. To most people, Kiss was still the Catman, the Spaceman, the Star Child, and the Demon. But the cat was already out of the bag, so to speak, as was the Spaceman. So in this case, to a certain extent, we sold a lot of sizzle without a very big steak.
Eric Carr must have felt as if the ground were moving under him every time he took a step. He was thrilled to join the Kiss he knew and loved, but the first record he played on was a concept album. The second was Creatures of the Night. Then, with the third record he played on, Kiss took off the makeup. After we took off our makeup and embraced the MTV age, the crowd changed dramatically. Back in the early days, we had started off with a bizarre crowd, opening for other bands, and Kiss was perceived as a dangerous band of rock metal rebels. When we became more mainstream, the toys and the games brought us a very young crowd. At some point, Mom and Dad would show up with their 3-year-old kids. It became like the circus. The 1980s brought us yet another shift. Suddenly, we were popular with teenage girls. They came to the show. They got in front. They screamed. And sometimes they seemed to want to do more than just scream. Some of them were clearly groupies in training. For the record, I should say that I never went after the underage ones. Enough legal-age girls were showing up. But these young girls would come backstage. They were always around. I would walk into my room, and usually there'd be a girl there. The early and mid-'80s were a troubling time for me in some respects. My connection to Kiss, the dominant part of my life for a decade, began to change. Mainly what happened was that I started to get lost. I didn't know how I was supposed to act, because the no-makeup version of the band was an entirely new idea. Paul was in his prime. He was very comfortable being who he was. Because in some ways, Paul is the same offstage as onstage. For those couple of years, it became more his band. Paul was always the guy who spoke in the interviews. When you saw photos of Kiss, they tended more and more to be photos of Paul. Still, if I stuck my tongue out enough times, I would eventually get in the frame. It's important to be clear about what happened. Paul didn't push me out of the spotlight. He would never do that to me. It's just that his ability to capture the public's attention increased as the music scene changed. My reaction was to try to muscle my way back into the spotlight by buying some truly outlandish, androgynous clothing. It didn't work, not the way I wanted it to. It just made me look like a football player in a tutu. This period also gave me an opportunity to watch Paul at work, and it was an interesting process. Paul's sense of things is what you'd more traditionally think of as the female perspective. Call me simplistic, but I think women are less interested in the end game, in winding up in bed with somebody, than in just being recognized for being attractive. Paul is more like that. Paul is less interested in whether the girl winds up in bed with him than in whether she finds him good-looking. I'm not interested in whether she finds me attractive. I'm only interested in whether she winds up in bed with me. Paul and I both like chocolate cake, so you would think we're alike, but we're completely different. He only likes the frosting. I hate the frosting. I only like the stuff you can chew, the devil's food. So if you walk by a cake and see the devil's food missing, you know I've been there. If you walk by and see the frosting missing, Paul's been there. Between the two of us, we can split a whole cake. So in a very real way, we are opposite pieces of the same puzzle. Somehow it worked. One of the funniest incidents in my life happened not on stage, but in the audience. It was in the mid-'80s, and I had gone to La Cage aux Folles, a drag nightclub in Los Angeles. It was a real show business crowd. Milton Berle was on my left with his wife, and other celebrities were there as well. The lights went down, and the music started for the pageant of drag queens. The first one to come out was dressed as Cher. The drag Cher paraded around and finally went off stage right. The next drag queen was dressed as Diana Ross, and right after that was a drag Liza Minnelli. That's the trinity for gay men, the ultimate divas, and all three of them were important in my life. I had first met Liza when I went with Cher to a party at Halston's. In 1979, I met her again. She was playing a few nights at Radio City Music Hall. I had no romantic aspirations, and I certainly didn't think of getting into Liza Minnelli's business. We became friends and would go to dinner occasionally. Whenever we got together, our conversation would turn to music. Liza would ask about Kiss. She wanted me to explain to her how it had all happened, how we had gone from obscurity to worldwide fame. I explained that it wasn't just one person. It was a huge confluence of record labels and management.
Up to that point, MTV had always ignored us. We had filmed one of those I Want My MTV promos, and they never aired it. The video we had shot for Creatures, I Love It Loud, didn't get played. They chose not to give us any exposure, even though we desperately needed it in the wake of the Elder debacle to show that we had recommitted ourselves to doing what Kiss did best. We were considered uncool at a network whose taste was led by a bunch of college interns. Suddenly, when we unmasked ourselves, all that changed. MTV finally embraced us at some level. We came up with a made-for-MTV unmasking. For most people, Kiss was still the Catman, the Spaceman, the Star Child, and the Demon. But the cat was already out of the bag, so to speak, as was the Spaceman. So in this case, to a certain extent, we sold a lot of sizzle without a very big steak.
street minding my own business. Now he looks me up and he looks me down and he says, hey man, what be this and what be that? And why you gotta look like that? Well, I just looked at him, I kind of laughed. I said, hey man, I am cool, I am the breeze. Haven't you heard? There's a new revolution. Gotta spread the word. Too much confusion. All hell breaking loose. Hey, hey, have you read the news? All hell breaking loose. All the loading and blow my fuse. All hell breaking loose. Day and night, baby, night and day. All hell breaking loose. In the streets, there's a brand new way.
Still, Kiss Unmasking made a great soundbite and people bought into it. We managed to turn that into something of an event and get press out of it. And it worked. I was convinced that Lick It Up wasn't as good as Creatures of the Night, but the album sold way, way better. Probably 4 or 5 times as many albums sold in just the first few weeks after its release in September 1983. It wasn't the music the people hadn't liked, it was how the band had looked. Once we took off the makeup, we no longer wore the platform boots on stage, and we adopted a more generic style, tight, colorful clothes, sexual and flamboyant. We slid into what was pretty much the common look at the time. I mean, Robert Plant had cut his hair and was wearing parachute pants, for God's sake. Since MTV had covered our unmasking, we figured that this time around they would probably play a music video if we made one. We weren't going to get a world premiere slot or anything, but we were hopeful it would get played. The video for Lick It Up was a bigger production than I Love It Loud, but we managed to keep the costs fairly low. Some artists were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on videos at the time, and that seemed crazy to us, especially in light of MTV's track record of not playing us in the past. We wanted to make Lick It Up for a reasonable amount of money. The video opened with an image of skulls, and if you watch very closely, you'll see one of them wobble a little. They were made out of latex. We shot the video in a burned-out area of the Bronx. Aside from a few props like the skulls, that was all real. We didn't do anything but show up. It looked like Dresden in 1945, a post-apocalyptic wasteland. But it wasn't a stage set. I'd never seen anything like that before. I hadn't spent much time in the South Bronx. The crazy thing was that it wasn't just one small area. It was huge, like an entire bombed-out city or a massive movie set. Broken down and decaying buildings as far as you could see, piles of bricks and rocks and garbage everywhere. It was the weirdest, most surreal thing I'd ever seen.
It's gonna make you see culture on fire, no sense desire, excited. Culture on fire, whisper my name, excited.
When I saw the complete edited video, I thought it was cool. It was an MTV video. It had girls, it had fire, it had weird hairdos. It had all the things MTV videos had. Eric hated it because he had these little drumstick legs, so he's walking and you see these little feet with high-pointed shoes and these thick legs. And people seeing Vinny asked, "Is that a girl?" When we shot the cover for Lick It Up, Vinny wore a wig and it looked great. Afterwards, he gave us a hard time and insisted on not wearing it again. But then his hair kind of looked like the Gerber baby. He was very odd looking anyway, and in that video he looked extra odd as he tried to look sexy for the camera. Lick It Up went on to be certified double platinum. That blew Creatures of the Night away and reaffirmed for me that my suspicions had been correct. It wasn't that people didn't want Kiss, they wanted Kiss to drop something that no longer seemed genuine. Losing the makeup forced people to focus on the band, and they embraced the music. Lick It Up felt like a rebound in other ways too, because shedding the makeup meant, in a sense, shedding an era, shedding a persona, and finally being out there, at least on the surface, as me. The person who was off stage was the same person in the videos. I felt that we had taken one very big step forward, and it meant that we could soldier on and continue to try to rebuild this thing I loved, Kiss. The next test would be playing live without makeup. Were we just a bunch of knuckleheads in spandex and grease paint who blew shit up? Or were we a band, able to go toe-to-toe with anybody else? We were about to find out.
You wanted the best! You got the best! The hottest band in the world! Kiss!
The show in Portugal in October 1983 started with our normal introduction. The hottest band in the land! And then, suddenly, there we were on stage without any makeup on. And we were in rock clothes instead of platform boots and bat wings and the usual armored accessories, for the first time ever. I looked over at Gene. He looks just like he did during soundcheck, and there's an audience out there. The crowd didn't understand what was going on. The show had been promoted as a makeup show. Posters all over town showed the old characters. It took a few minutes for people to catch on. Did it have the same visual impact? No. I could feel the difference from the stage, but we had to leave all that behind to find out who we were. I wasn't sick of the makeup, I was sick of what it had become. We had to give it up to save what we loved most, the band. This was exciting and liberating too. I relished the chance to prove ourselves all over again, not just to critics and the audience, but also to myself. On that tour, I realized that the most difficult part of taking off the makeup wasn't performing without the star, it was adjusting to getting my picture taken. Since we had originally determined not to be photographed without makeup in order to enhance our stage personas, I had a neurotic sixth sense that allowed me to feel cameras anywhere, even if it was in my peripheral vision or far off in the distance. When we took off the makeup, I still reflexively covered my face whenever I detected a camera. Vinny continued to baffle me. He still refused to sign his contract. He kept promising to sign it, but he never did. And there was no way to make him. We were stuck with no choice but to continue.
Come on, lick my candy cane!
We played in Oulu in northern Finland at the end of November 1983. It was the closest I'd ever been to the Soviet Union, maybe 100 miles from the border. We traveled all day to get there, and when we arrived at the arena, it was bitter cold. I had to wear gloves and several layers of clothing in the backstage area. We were also starving after traveling all day and were very happy when a huge bowl of hearty beef soup was served. We sat around the family-style cauldron and ladled the soup into our bowls. It was so good, vegetables and beef in a flavorful broth, nice and warming. Vinny ate part of his bowl and then, saying he was finished, dumped the leftovers back into the cauldron in the middle of the table. We all looked at him in disbelief. "Where did you grow up? What are you doing? You just ruined our food." Things with Vinny were getting worse and worse. He kept pushing his solos to more and more ridiculously epic lengths, stalling the show. The final straw came at a concert back in the States, in Long Beach, California, in January 1984. That night he went on for so long that Gene and I just walked back on stage as he was still playing. I went to the mic and said, "Vinnie Vincent, lead guitar." Solo over. When the lights went down after the next song, Vinny came over to me in the dark and said, "You bastard, you humiliated me." I swear if he raises his arm, I'm going to knock him out right here. It was a tense moment. I thought for sure the lights were going to come up and that prick would be lying on his back on the stage. He was done.